Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger McKenzie, Assistant General Secretary of UNISON. I'm delighted to welcome you back to our Aspects of Organising webinar series, where we spend some time talking about different aspects of organising, as it says on the tin, but with some people who've experienced those different ways of building our movement and different perspectives on building our movement. And some weeks ago, we had the first part of a discussion with my sister, my friend, family, Marie Clarke Walker, who's the Secretary-Treasurer of the Canadian Labour Congress. And welcome again, Marie. Really glad that you could spare some time to come and join us for the second part of this.
Always a pleasure, Roger. Always a pleasure.
No, it's always a pleasure to see you. And while I've got you here as well, thanks so much for doing such an inspirational talk on our May Day, Roger's birthday kind of rally that we did on the 1st of May. I thought that was an inspirational day. I thought it was good, and we want to follow that up with some future talks with those same people as well, to look at building those links. I suppose for this discussion, continuing the discussion that we had last time, I think where we left it was that I remember getting a call from you just after we came back from Durban, and the world had changed because we just had 9/11 and all of that. And you started to say, you know what, thinking of running for office within the Canadian Labour Congress, and think I got the support, think we can win this. I think we're gonna do this. Now, the election process in the Canadian Labour Congress, actually in North America, is very different to the UK. Could you say a little bit about why you thought you could do it, and why it was important for you to do it, and a little bit maybe about the process that you had to go through?
Thanks, Roger. So we came back from Durban in September, and in October of 2001, Nancy Rich, who was the Secretary-Treasurer of the Canadian Labour Congress at the time, had a women's retreat. It was the first retreat that women who were not on the Canadian Labour Congress's Women's Committee had been invited to. So there were women that were on the Workers of Color Working Group, there were women from the Indigenous Working Group, there were women from the Disability Rights Working Group, there were women from the Solidarity and Pride Working Group, as well as other women that didn't necessarily belong to any of the committees that the Canadian Labour Congress had constituted. And it was an effort to hear voices. I think what Nancy was trying to do at that time, actually, I know what she was trying to do at that time, was to make sure that everybody's voices was heard, because one of the criticisms of the labor movement, particularly the women's movement, is that it is a white middle-class women's movement, and oftentimes voices of others are not heard. So she wanted to give an opportunity for that. And what happened, what came out of that meeting was a full-blown discussion on changing the culture and the structure of the labor movement. And so the focus was then placed on those of us who were there to run for positions. At that time, I was already in a position at CUPE. I was the diversity vice president at CUPE. And, you know, while I had thought about the CLC, I hadn't thought about it from an officer's perspective. I had thought about running for diversity VP, right? Representing workers of color. And then we had
just on that, because doesn't that say a lot that quite often Black people are either funneled into those kind of diversity, equality type, as we would say, over equality type jobs, and that's often the extent that we see. Yeah. Our kind of ambition that we can run for that. True. Or we can try for that job. Yeah.
And on the flip side, unions often feel that if they have these committees and these seats, that's all they need to do.
Yeah.
Right. But we know that what happens a lot of the time when you get into these seats or get onto these committees, there's limited power. You really don't have that power to change. So, while I was thinking initially diversity seat or vice president representing workers of color, the more that I thought about it, and these thoughts are even before Durban. So the more that I thought about it, and I think Durban really changed my trajectory, because then I realized I was at a conference with, I don't know how many people, but a lot of the labor activists that were there were racialized. So, and they were in all kinds of positions. You talked about Bill Lucy a little while ago. We had leaders, Cleola Brown, Mary Fingers, Bill Lucy, all big leaders in the US. So if there could be that happening in the US, why couldn't the same thing happen here? And so I think I was fortunate in that I had a president in Judy Darcy who believed that it was time for change, who believed that we really needed to hear the voices of everyone at the Central Labor Body. And so I think you were there, Roger, at our Human Rights Committee meeting, our conference in Toronto. Judy Darcy was there, and that is where she asked whether or not I'd be interested. And I think I pulled all of you together, my mom, Carol, yourself, and we had a discussion. And yes, we all felt it was past time. And so, yes, I was very excited to be asked to run. And that excitement was there right up until, I got elected, and I was still excited. But I realized that there was an issue, I mean, long before. But once I got to the Congress, I realized that the issue was much bigger than what we were pushing for. So we're outside, not necessarily an elected position, but outside pushing the labor movement to make these changes. And your voice is loud, my voice is loud. We had demonstrations. We would always be pushing back, and I would be saying it can be that difficult. If you have the political will, we should be able to make the changes that are necessary. We shouldn't have to be an add-on as racialized folks, as Indigenous folks, as LGBTQ folks, as disability rights members and workers. But what I found when I got there was a system that was even more bureaucratic than government. It shouldn't be that difficult to do what is the correct thing to do. But, if the rest of the leadership are not on the same page, you can't make changes. If the affiliates, those are the ones that you represent, are not on the same page, you can't make those changes that are necessary. So, I quickly found out that all of the things that I wanted to do, all of the things that, activists have been talking about trying to get done in the labor movement was a lot more difficult because there were barriers and roadblocks put the entire time. What that told me was that the rest of the movement wasn't ready for change. So we had to do things to prepare them for that. And so I think from the very beginning, I started talking out about, committees are not enough, seats are not enough. We actually have to have action. And it was not the glamorous position that I thought it would be. It was extremely stressful. It was, I experienced, dismissal. We had ideas, ways in which we could do things differently, but the movement wasn't ready to hear. They didn't want to hear. And I think what happens when, and it may be just human nature, when folks that are around you and that are excited to see something change and to do something change, because we were the slate, or we weren't really a slate, but we were the elected people that were running on the change platform. We wanted to see change, and we wanted to see change for the better. We wanted to make sure that every single member that belonged to a labor union was properly represented. But it was clear that, Carol Wall said it best. When we were running for election in 2002, she made a comment about people, and I think I talked about it on the last meeting, people coming to do good, but staying to do well. And that's what we had at the CLC and within the labor movement. And, you know, I'm picking on CLC in Canada, but it's the international labor movement. It is the international labor. People come with good intentions.
Yeah.
Good intentions. But there are benefits. And rather than continuing to do what's good for the benefit of the majority of the workers, people then start to do what's in their own best interest.
So that and I feel that I kind of always have to work this out myself as well, is that it takes a toll on you being the first or one of the pioneers, if you want to use that word.
There are expectations.
Yeah, so there's expectations on you from your colleagues, but also from the membership, people who see you, because you are very, very visible across Canada, I guess, as I am across the UK, and that brings with it an added pressure. And if you're not able to do the things that you know need to be done, could you maybe say a little bit about your kind of coping mechanisms for dealing with stuff like that? Because I know it's hard.
Before I go to coping mechanisms, and you had asked me a question the last time and I didn't answer it, and I think that it's important for me to answer.
Okay.
Things were difficult. Things were difficult, and I can't say why. I don't know if the person just didn't like me, the person didn't like women of color. I don't know what their rationale was. All I know was that the impact that it had, the treatment had on me, was something that made me ill, like sick, physically ill. When you are elected to a position and there are expectations from rank and file about, you know, the things that you can do, and you realize you can't do those things that they expected you to do or you thought you could do because of a whole host of reasons. For me, it weighed on me. It was what I carried around with me all the time. Here it is, I was elected to do something, to make a change, and I couldn't do it. And when I say I couldn't do it, it's not because the folks listening, it's not because I didn't want to do it. I was in a situation where, you know, I would be invited to participate in particular events because of who I am, what I look like, but also because of my position, right?
And jumping in on that, because of course I did invite you to, at the time I was working for the TUC, and I was the National Race Equality Policy Officer, and I invited you as probably the most visible Black woman trade unionist in the Northern Hemisphere, for sure, right? No question. And I remember getting hauled in to withdraw the invitation because of a phone call from your then boss, who basically blocked it.
That happened quite a bit, Roger. I'll talk about yours a bit. I mean, as the chair of the women's committee, we were doing stuff with the maquilladoras. I had flights, you know, canceled. I would come to work and, you know, be putting things together to get ready to go somewhere and realize that my flight had been canceled by the president, or something that I was supposed to be attending. He had called and said, no, she's not available. But to your situation, you had invited, or the TUC had invited me to the Black Workers Conference, and the theme of that conference that year was Black women's struggles and successes. And while I knew you, I knew other people on the committee as well, and I believe it was a committee decision.
Yeah, it was. And you'd met some of these people in Durban, actually, which is why they wanted to invite you.
And the rationale was because I was the first. I was the first. They wanted to talk about how, you know, the challenges to get there, the successes of getting there, all of those things. And so I was excited to do it because I thought that, you know, it was a way to get my story out. It was a way to assist others who might be going through the same thing. Instead, I was told that a call was made to the general secretary at the time of TUC, who was then told that he had invited the wrong officer. So let's look at the makeup of the officers at the Canadian Labour Congress at that time. President was a white man. Secretary-Treasurer was a man of color. Other vice president, executive vice president, was a white woman. So Black women's struggles and successes, the only logical person to speak to Black women's struggles and successes was me. And your organization was told they invited the wrong officer. Well, I know at the time I was in Australia doing the ITUC, or at the time ICFTU Women's Conference. And when I got back, I was told the same thing, that it had been canceled. I wasn't the correct officer. I wasn't responsible for anti-racism, and it was a anti-racism conference because it was called a Black conference, and therefore, they needed to send the officer responsible for anti-racism. So I went to the officer responsible for anti-racism, who was our current president, and said, on your way home tonight, make sure you pass by the house. I got a pair of high heels and a dress that you can borrow since you're going to this conference on Black women's struggles and successes. And to that, he responded, there's no way in hell I'm going. So, we had a little bit of fun with it, but that was my coping mechanism, to poke fun at the various things that I wasn't allowed to go to. Files were taken away from me. Again, another incident off of Durban as well was one of the universities here, Ryerson University, had invited me to speak to their Caribbean and African Students Association about the conference. And not just the World Conference Against Racism, but also the conference, the African Descendants Conference that happened directly after. So World Conference was in September, and the African Descendants Conference was, I believe, the year after in October.
Yeah.
And there was an issue at that conference. And again, people have to understand, for Black folks, we've been fighting for self-determination forever. We're in spaces and people keep determining what is best for us, what we should do, how we should handle it. And we've been pushing back for decades, for centuries, saying, no, it's our decision. We should be able to decide. So we had an African Descendants conference in Barbados, and the conference decided whether it was the correct thing to do is not for me to determine, not for you to determine. The conference organizers decided that they wanted to do things in a particular way. I went and suggested that they may want to try something different, something that we've done in the labor movement. Rather than telling the allies to leave, let's start an allies workshop where the allies can talk about what it is they can do to assist, or come and ask us what it is we want. What do we want them to do? However, that suggestion was not taken, and while white folks were asked to leave the conference, they didn't. And things eventually worked out. But Ryerson wanted me to talk about the solutions that we could have found for that. And again, I was told it wasn't my file to cancel the engagement. UFCW, United Food and Commercial Workers, invited me to speak to their women's conference. Their president was called and told, sorry, can you disinvite her? And that was done via email. So it wasn't like these things, we saw the emails, people released the emails, people told us what had happened. And it was hard. It was really, really hard, because I felt that I had let people down. But
that's something that, that's a really important point, actually, because I think many of us as kind of prominent Black trade unionists, if I can use that expression, when we can't do the thing, for whatever reason, when we can't do the things that we know people kind of expect us to do, that we've always tried to do, and all of that, that it's a heavy weight. It's a really heavy weight.
Try not to let down or abandon your community. I mean, that is also something we talk about, something that I have been very critical of. When Black folks get elected into positions or appointed into positions, all of a sudden you don't see them anymore. They're not part of your community. And that was not me. It's not me. And I didn't want to be able to do that. So things that were happening in the community, I wanted to stay involved in that. And it was very, very difficult because time after time I was told, it's not your role. It doesn't matter. Why do you need to go? And I'm like, I still belong to this community. This is my community. My kids are growing up in the community. My mom, my family is part of it. I will always be part of the community. I'll always be a Black woman. That ain't changing anytime soon. You know, and if you can't be part of your own community, help your own community with the issues that they're going through, the issues that they're dealing with, then what's the point? You know?
But one of the things around that, Marie, that I always kind of think of is that we came to this movement with that work already, something that we just did as natural. And as you were saying earlier on, you know, your parents were both activists and, you know, really prominent and done a lot. Mine weren't activists, but were respected within their community and all of that stuff. This is something that we were brought up to do. And it led us into, you know, when we start talking about the collectivism of doing things within our communities, the collectivism that we take just as natural into the trade union movement, and we expect everybody else to behave in a collective way and have that kind of understanding from where we're coming from. We're not just, you know, we have a whole heritage and a whole trauma actually that we've been dealing with forever, right? That goes back way before any of us were born, right? A whole trauma that we are trying to deal with, and that we have dedicated our lives to standing up and organising and fighting to do something about. And that's what informs us every day. It's not an intellectual kind of argument for us. This is this is our DNA actually. This is what we do, you know.
Yeah, which is why CBTU seemed to be the natural place for everybody to be, right? Yeah. And so rather than, you know, pining away and feeling sorry for myself because I couldn't do, you know, what it is I thought that I was elected to do, and it was hard, I threw myself into CBTU, Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. I threw myself into community, and it became a little bit easier when I was exiled. So folks are probably saying, exile? What are you talking about? Well, so I was elected in 2002, re-elected again in 2005. 2005, there was an actual election because somebody ran against the president. One of our sisters ran against the president. By the way, I was accused of running her campaign, being part of her all kinds of stuff. And so elected in 2005, elected again in 2008. And in 2009 was asked, or I think shortly after the election in 2008, was told, not asked, was told that my assignment would now, I'd be stripped of my files and I would be sent back home. Home for me was Toronto. Now, what was interesting about that is that when I was elected in 2002, I had 2 small children. And I had asked at that time, you know, is it possible to work from Toronto and then just, you know, transport back and forth? And was told, no, Constitution is clear, you have to be in Ottawa. So I went to Ottawa, I left my kids in Toronto. Reason being, and I think this is important, particularly for women who have children that want to run, my children were doing well in the community that they're in. I have 2 Black boys that are not the average Black boys. They're quite tall and they
quite tall.
They stand out, right? And they're my 2 biological children. But I also have other children that I've raised. And for me, it was important for them to remain in their community because that is where their supports were. They were doing very well in school. And we all know statistics. You remove young Black boys out of somewhere where they're comfortable, where they are, you know, achieving, and you put them into something where they don't know, they're not sure, they don't have any friends, you know, all of those things, it has a negative impact on them. So I wanted to keep them in a place where they were doing well. And so I was in Ottawa, my kids were in Toronto, and it was difficult. But as I said, I had that community and I utilized that community to help me raise my children. It also was a time where we had cell phones, we had computers, we have regular telephones. So I was able to have conversations and parent my children from afar, but they also got a lot of benefits out of this as well. And I know I started going down a tangent, and like usually happens, Roger, I start going down a tangent, I forget where I was going with it. But anyway, all of that to say that community was important. It was important for my kids to remain in their community. So when I was sent back to Toronto, I looked at it as a negative, because I fought that fight in 2002, lost that fight, came to the realization, okay, they're fine where they are. I'm doing okay where I am. We're making it work. And then when I was told your files would be taken away, you'd be sent back to Toronto, I fought it, because it wasn't okay to do that back in 2002. So why is it okay to do it now? And if you're sending me to Toronto because you feel for me and my family and my children, then why are you taking my files away? You're just sending me to Toronto. You're not giving me any files. Anyway, in any event, we always try and make a positive out of a negative, and that's what we did. So I got involved. I immersed myself in what was happening in the labor movement in Toronto, what was happening in the community in Toronto, and began going to community meetings. I became the co-chair of one of the community coalitions. We did civic engagement. So we were helping around elections, doing education, doing training, taking people to the polls, all of that community stuff that you don't usually get to do when you're in an office or a position that I am in. So I'm thankful. At the end of the day, I'm thankful for that exile, because it helped to sort of pull together and bridge that gap between labor and community organizations.
But at the same time, Marie, we had conversations during that time, and I know how hard that was for you, and I know how strong you had to be, and I know that your family were amazing during that period, and the way that they stood next to you, and that was just so, it was so powerful to see, and I remember at one point just thinking that I'm going to get on a plane and get over to Canada and just give some support as best as I could, because that's how important it was what you were going through. And I think one of the saddest things for me about the trade union movement at the minute is that we tend to get all our news about what's happening in the trade union movement, it's either about the UK or the US, and actually hardly anything about Canada, which is why I was so keen that we had this discussion anyway. But also another discussion that we are going to have at some point is with sisters, brothers in Brazil, where there are more people of African descent outside of Nigeria, basically. That it's so important that we change the axis of the discussion, because people listening to this now will be thinking, why didn't I hear anything about this? What is going on? All these labour movement things that I read, all these labour movement things that I hear about, and I'm not hearing about this.
Part of it too is my fault. Because I tried to protect the movement. Sure. When you love a movement and when you believe that movement can actually work really well for your community, that naturally you do that. And so, yes, I still am very protective of the movement, because I think it's the only movement where we can act collectively to make the changes that are needed. Whether or not the leadership of the movement are there, that's another thing. That's a different discussion. I remember having a discussion about equity and the movement, and not just the Canadian labor movement, but the international movement. And I remember a leader saying to me, oh, we won't have to work on that forever. When we get 50% of women, we're fine. We're going to be able to. And I'm like, no, this is something that is constant. You always have to be working towards equity. You always have to be having that in the background, particularly in a country like Canada or the UK, where that population that racialized population mass is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And, I argue, people will say that, I don't even know now, 2027 or whatever, we'll have parity in terms of racialized workers and white workers in Canada. I think we're already past that. I think that because, and people don't look at our history, the history of work for racialized people. It's a history of paid and unpaid work.
Exactly.
Slavery, but it's work. And we have been working in these countries for centuries and not getting the credit, not getting the recognition, and not getting the respect that I believe is owed to Indigenous people and to Black people for their building of many of these countries.
Yeah, and that for me is like the nub of the issue as well, because from that we have to then start thinking about how do we build this movement strong enough, equitable, but strong enough to be able to make a difference for not just us Black people, but because actually if we change things, it makes a difference for everybody.
Exactly.
How do we actually do that? And one of the things that I've said to people, to your point, that if the movement's not ready, and that's a challenge for us. I mean, it certainly is a challenge, because one of the things that I've seen in recent months, in particular, but years, last year and a half or so, are so many people who see themselves as, socialists, as trade unionists. They carry the card. They've been to every conference, marched on every march, and literally some of their behaviours leave a lot to be desired. And I'm being really kind in the way that I've put that. I think that's really challenging for us. How we break down that barrier of what the word is, but it's a delusion. They have a self-delusion that they don't need to listen to us as Black people, because either their particular political party, whatever that is, will tell them what to do, and then they'll follow that, or they have the line already. Instead of listening to what Black folks have to say about how we want to organise, because that organising for us comes out of a particular experience, a particular heritage that is actually important for us to use to move forward. I mean, the great academic Robin D.G. Kelly, California University, he's written some, I mean, you'll know, he's written some amazing stuff about what we've had to put up with from across the labour movement, and some of the excuses that have been made about why it's difficult to, at this particular time, to do as much as we want. But actually, the nub of what he writes about, and what's been confirmed to me in recent times, is people don't listen to what we've got to say. They've decided before we open our mouths what it is. And and for me, that's a real hindrance to building organising strategies for our movement. Because how are we going to move forward unless we actually listen to what people who are at the receiving end are actually saying they want, rather than to have a ready-made, it's like, it's a kind of ready-made strategy for us. And all we have to do is listen and follow them, and everything's going to be all right. And it won't be all right. It won't be.
No, it's why I think we need to be building coalitions of Black trade unionists.
And you see, that is, you got CBTU, and many people watching this call probably wouldn't have heard too much about the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. I mean, I'm one of the people trying to build that movement in the UK, and I've been lucky enough to be at 2 CBTU conferences, and those of you who would have watched the calls with. Actually, we've only ever done two parters, So you're one of them, and Bill Luce is the other one, by the way. And so
both
Bill
of us
Luce,
need to be on.
well, we're going to sort that as well, actually. That's such a good idea, actually. We're going to do that. Actually, we will do that.
Because Bill is one of the reasons that I'm still here.
Yeah, me too, actually. Me too. Because it's that mentorship and support, and somebody who just doesn't, he doesn't necessarily tell you what to do, but he'll guide you in that direction.
So let me just make a point, because I think out of respect, I think it's important that people need to know that when I was going through my worst times, that the only international Black leader that was able to come to my defense in the way that I needed was Bill Luce. I had, Roger, don't get me wrong, I had, you and others that were international.
But not Bill Luce. I'm not Bill Luce.
But
that's a different level.
When it counted, when he needed to speak up and say that this is wrong, he did. And for that, I will be forever grateful. And he has always said to me, hang in there, stay strong, and you have to show that strength when you're in public. But I need folks to know I'm human. Yeah. Roger, you're human. When we are not in front of a camera, not in front of a bunch of workers, doing what we do best, it can be very lonely. And back to your first question. At some point, it became lonely because nobody wanted to touch what was happening. They didn't want it to happen to them. Not realizing at the end of the day, you do nothing, it's going to happen to you anyway. Yeah. Particularly if nothing is said and nothing is done. So that's where we find ourselves now. Yeah. And I think that, I 100% identify with what you're saying. And I know that there's other Black trade unionists in the UK who are in relatively senior positions who will understand that entirely. We talked about Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, one of the most influential, longest standing, set up in 1972 bodies. But fairly recently, we set up another body called the Global African Workers Institute. Now, you're one of the founding members of that. Why? Why did we need that? Because I think that at the time, CBTU was just the Americas for the most part, and we needed to globalize our workers. We needed to globalize Black workers so that they could see that the issues are similar, if not the same, no matter where we are. The issue of racism always permeates through everything that we do. But if we are working globally together, we can fight it at a global level. And I know that I always talk about the fact that big business, employers, governments have globalized themselves. And they're working together to screw workers, no matter where workers are. And so if we as Black workers don't globalize ourselves, don't pull ourselves together, then we're going to be left behind as well. It's the best way to come up with a solid global strategy to deal with all the issues that we're currently dealing with. And if we're talking to each other all the time and doing that, things will be a little, in my opinion, a little bit easier. If everybody's hearing the same message, if all of the affiliates, whether they're in the UK, Canada, Ghana, Nigeria, Australia, wherever they are, if they're all hearing the same message and doing the same kinds of, we as in Black workers are doing the same kinds of things and sending the same kinds of messages to their national bodies, international bodies, I think we can make a difference. Yeah, and that's almost word for word as I can remember those years ago when we sat down in a
in a room in Washington, D.C., I think it was, when we had the
Yep.
discussion about setting up a more global body to raise these issues. And in fact, I mean, if anything that's come through to us through this pandemic period, it's the importance of having a global approach as well as a local approach, particularly for us as Black people, isn't it? You know?
And that's why one of the reasons that I always talk about Black Lives Matter, because I can't speak to the global impact, but in Canada, when Black Lives Matter sat in the middle of a pride parade to make a point, I watched as labor activists, community activists got upset because they didn't understand what Black Lives Matter was doing. Black Lives Matter was saying, this is how it started, this is how we're going to end it. So the Pride Parade, back in the day, there were raids on bathhouses, which began like a pushback against police brutality of gay and trans men, and just all the crap that they were doing. And so at that time, a number of years ago, there were some issues and attacks against the trans community. So Black Lives Matter sat in the middle of a pride parade and blocked it because they wanted people to hear the message, and they had to, of dealing with just those issues. Black Lives Matter wanted to send the message that we're not just about Black lives. We're about equity. We're about making sure that marginalized groups don't get left behind, that the general public, general population understands the connectedness, you know, and we started this, and I neglected to say that I was coming to you from the traditional unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and I'm here as a settler and recognize that the struggles of Indigenous people and the struggles of Black people are intrinsically connected. So I want to say that because it was the first time, I think, that the general trade union movement saw what it was Black Lives Matter was about. But that is how you organize. You can't just organize for yourself and what's best for your community. You also have to pull others in and be there to support others in their struggles. And that's what Black Lives Matter did. So they were there for the LGBTQ community. They were there when Idle No More and the Indigenous community needed assistance, when we were pushing for an inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women. And obviously they are there for their own community, who are getting shot down in the streets, who are getting fired, who are, you know, having issues at work with not being represented. And so Black Lives Matter is in my opinion, an example of organizing at its best. Making sure you pull everybody in, that you are there standing with your allies in their times of struggles as well.
Critical.
And the labor movement can learn a friggin' lot from an organization like Black Lives Matter, because over the years, when I got involved, we were there supporting all kinds of struggles. I find that over the years, we have stepped away from that and stepped back into, we're protecting ourselves. We're not there for everyone else, or we're protecting only unionized workers. And you would know from my very first election, while I'm there representing the unions that belong to the Canadian Labour Congress, I am really there to represent workers and our potential union members who are not members of unions yet. So, you know, when we fight, we're fighting for all workers, whether they're in the formal or informal economy, whether they're in paid or unpaid work. And it's what I've done from the very beginning, before I started my career, fighting for, you know, the rights of everybody. And that's how we're going to end. That's how we're going to end. We will not end. We can't end the struggle until everybody's under the tent and everybody's taken care of.
So there's a question that just popped up from my colleague Monica, who's abusing her privilege of working with us, but to make sure she gets on somehow. But I think it's a really, really good question, actually. So who inspired you to keep going?
There were a few. My kids. I tell the story often of, you know, 2 years, I think it was 2 years in, I went home because I was in Ottawa. My kids were in Toronto. I came home to Toronto, and I'd had it. Enough. I turned to my youngest child and I said, you know what? You're going to get your wish. Mommy's coming home. And he looked at me with the most horrified look and said, you're quitting? You didn't teach us to quit. You're not a quitter. What do you mean you're coming home? And I just this whole back and forth. And I thought, okay. So all those times we think that our kids aren't listening and they haven't heard what we're saying and they don't understand what we're doing, they get it. And I think that pushback made me stop and say, well, the whole reason that I'm doing this anyway, and Roger, I think we probably had that conversation 20 years ago plus.
Yeah.
You know, the only reason we're doing it, we realize it's too late for us because the change that's needed is going to take time. We're doing it for future generations. And so the fact that I was or could be failing my children and my children's children kept me moving, kept me going, kept me doing what I thought was the correct thing to do. The other thing that kept me going was my community. Because frankly, the labor movement was not there for me. My community kept me going. The Coalition of Black Trade Unionists who would meet at my house to strategize on all kinds of stuff on a regular basis. People in the community, my mom, my family, Roger, you. I mean, the little telephone calls or just the little messages that said, hey, how you doing, sis? And those things I do because they helped me. And I figure if they helped me, they could be helping somebody else who's going through the same thing. A simple note to say, hey, I'm thinking about you. Hey, is there anything you need? Is there anything I can do? Simple as that. That's what kept me going. And the hope that the future will be better for the next generation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, you've done that for me. And I know you've done that for so many people as well, just there with the support. And it's so, it gives a lot of us, including me, a lot of strength to know that you're there. And I can always just contact you for just to offload, frankly, sometimes, or just knowing that you're around. And you are such an inspiration to me and to so many people across our movement. And you're not done yet. So what's next for Marie Clarke Walker?
Well, I don't know. The last meeting that you and I were on, I was contemplating putting my name forward for the International Labour Organization Director General. I really was contemplating that, but there are a lot of other things that we also need to get done. I understand that, you know, there's a lot to that process, and we are a little behind in the process. So, you know, if that happens at some point, I'd be very happy, but I will continue in whatever capacity to push forward for the rights of Black workers and women workers. Actually, in all the work that I do, I always push for the underdog, or what's called our equity-seeking groups, those who are in groups, what they call vulnerable groups or groups in vulnerable situations. I guess we're both real vulnerable right now, Roger, because we fit that bill. But I will continue to be there for them, to be there as an ear to listen. Sometimes there's nothing that we can do that will help a situation, but as long as we're there, lending an ear, being there beside somebody to let them know that they're not going through this by themselves, I think that works. And I think that there's a lot of hope. I'm seeing some young folks come up in the movement that really have me smiling, that really have given me hope that, you know, all of this is not for naught.
Well, I think the same as well. I think there is a lot of cause for optimism, real hope, actually, more than optimism, because when you do look around, this nonsense really that a lot of people say that people are just apathetic and they're not prepared to do anything. That's rubbish, right? Give people the right issue and people will go out and organise. Give people the right support and people will get up every morning really early and, you know, be ready for, you know, to do the necessary organising work. There, you know, it's that inspiration, it's that support, it's that guidance, mentorship, but also the right example that we have to give people. But when you were talking about working with fighting for a wider movement, it kind of reminded me. I don't know if you've seen the film about the Fred Hampton film, the recent one that's come out. But the whole idea around the Rainbow Coalition and bringing people together, I just think is so powerful. And I heard a podcast yesterday, which was from the guy who was the leader of the Young Patriots, I think they were called. So the white kind of hillbilly group that were part of the coalition. I might have got the name wrong, but he was part of that white group, and he was talking about the building of that movement, and how it's been, and how important it was for people to stand together because they're experiencing the same things, just in a slightly different way.
Right.
And it was important for people who came from, kind of Lookout Mountain, Tennessee, or wherever it was, to have a solidarity with people who came from the South up to Chicago, to work in the factories up there, to and to do the things that they did up there. But they developed this solidarity, and that's why it was so. That's what was so dangerous to the establishment. And I think we have to remember things like that. That even though you and I spend a lot of time organising around anti-racism for Black workers, that you and I and people who work with us have never lost sight of the importance of that wider perspective. Because if we ever lost that, we're actually forgetting the fundamental issue about why we're in the movement, and that is about building real power for working people. And you don't build that real power for working people unless you understand that it's for all working people. But at this moment in time, and this is why we say to a lot of people, Black Lives Matter, is because our house is burning down. And when our house is burning down, what we don't expect our neighbour to say to us is, what about my house? Right? We expect our neighbour to say, I'm there for you.
Yep.
I will help you to put out this fire,
right.
because I know you will help me to put out the fire if it was at my house. And that's what we need to do. And that's the importance of the work that we do. So when we talk about organising, it's not a narrow organising stance at all. It's really very broad, but it's actually about bringing everybody on. Everybody. Because for far too long, people who look like you and me have been excluded. And you don't build a powerful movement for working class people when there's a whole bunch of us who've been excluded from the time, as you said, when we were working for nothing, to the time then we're working for a pittance quite often. We won't move on as a people. So for me, that's the important thing that I get from this discussion, that it's hard. There are times when it gets really, really hard. There are times when it gets really personally, it's almost catastrophically hard. But actually, our need is to build the alliances, is to build the strength, is to build the collaboration, is to build the I think somebody said to me, we want allies and stuff like that. I'm not really interested in too many allies. I'm interested in collaborators, people who roll up their sleeves and get the stuff done alongside me. I don't want people just to tell me that they're against racism. I want people to go out and organise with me against racism.
I agree to a point.
Right,
I still think we need allies, because everybody doesn't come to the same place at the same time.
Okay, accept that. Yeah.
So the allies can be there, and once they feel comfortable collaborating, they can cross over to that.
Yeah. Okay, so it's how we move people on from allyship to actually doing something, because I think part of the problem is far too often people are comfortable in allyship that really is about what they do on the internet, And I'm not saying that we don't use the internet to help us to organise, because we do. Quite clearly we're doing that now. But it's also about how you shift somebody on from saying something like, I don't see colour, for example.
Then you don't see me.
Right, so you don't see me and you don't hear me then.
That's right.
And that's the thing for me, is shifting somebody as organisers from A to B.
And just getting them to understand, like, not everybody uses the same language. And I think we also have to do a better job of explaining our language, right? So when we talk about defund the police and people take that literally, defunding the police is what we do all the time as labor organizations, push for reallocation of funds to do, a redistribution of funds and break down particular parts of the police force. It's not about taking away a police force. In some communities it might be, but in general, it's about how they use the funds that they get, the resources that they get, and who they send to particular calls. You shouldn't be sending police officers to deal with domestic violence. You shouldn't be sending police officers to deal with issues of discrimination and race. They all need to be trained as to how to do it. And right now, they don't have that training. They need to be, but until they get to that point, you need people who this is what they do for a living, right? To be there. So there's all kinds of things that we need to do as well to make things, I won't say easier for others, but to make it more understandable, and more understandable also for some of the folks in our own communities who just don't get it or refuse to get it, or, I think that part is also critically important for us to stand up in solidarity with all those groups that I mentioned, all those organizations, is also critically important. We know that whole story about, and we've heard it from the time we were small. They came for, the Christians, and nobody did anything. So they took them, they came all the way until they came for us, and there was nobody there to support or to help us. And so, because nobody else stepped up to help anyone else. We need to get past that. We need to stop. We need to be there to support each other. And if people don't understand what that support means or what it's supposed to look like, then ask, do something.
Well, I mean, we've come to the end of the time that we've got for this webinar, and I just want to thank you as somebody who has always stepped up, and somebody who I know will continue to step up in whatever role. But it's important that you are there, and you are continue to do what you do, because what you do is extraordinary. You bring people together, you build movements, you build confidence, you build people up, and that's an invaluable skill to have, Marie, and you have it. And just thank you for all you do. Thank you for all you're going to continue to do. And I know that you and I have got a lot of work that we are going to do together in the future.
I definitely have a little bit more time to be a shit disturber. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one. Marie, thanks ever so much. And can I thank everybody who's tuned in to this webinar, which I think's been extraordinary discussion. And can I just ask you all to look out for news of future discussions that we're going to have, but we're going to do this one where we're going to have Marie and Bill together, because I think that would be an extraordinary discussion as well. But we're definitely going to do that at some point. But just look out for the announcements for future discussions, and share this one round, please, when it comes out around social media. Just share it out. Let's get this kind of discussion going about the challenges that we face, but importantly as well, how we meet those challenges as well. So thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. Marie, again, thank you for everything, what you do, and thanks for being family. It's important to me. Thank you. So thanks, everybody. Take care. Stay safe, everyone.
Bye, everyone.